The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood by the large window in his study. His hands trembled slightly as he held the official letter that would change everything. The military deployment orders were clear and final. He would be leaving for the Falkland Islands in just 3 days. Catherine had been in the garden with their young children, George and Charlotte, when William received the call from his commanding officer. The sound of their laughter drifted through the open window, making his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he would soon have to tell them. This wasn't just any ordinary separation. The mission was classified, dangerous, and would keep him away for 6 long months. William had always known that his dual role as a prince and a military officer would create difficult moments like this. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of leaving his family behind. Catherine had been his rock through everything, from their university days at St. Andrews to their royal wedding, and through the challenges of raising children in the public eye. As he watched her playing with George and Charlotte on the perfectly manicured lawn, William remembered their early conversations about military service. Catherine had always been supportive, understanding that his commitment to the Royal Air Force was something that gave his life purpose beyond his royal duties. She knew that serving his country wasn't just a job for William. It was a calling that connected him to something larger than himself. The couple had faced separations before, but this felt different. The children were older now, more aware of their father's absence. George, at 8 years old, had already begun asking difficult questions about why Daddy had to go away for work so often. Charlotte, with her bright eyes and curious nature, would undoubtedly notice every day that passed without her father's bedtime stories. William closed his eyes and tried to gather the courage he would need for the conversation ahead. He had faced many challenges in his life, from losing his mother at a young age to the intense scrutiny of growing up in the public eye. But telling the woman he loved that he would be leaving for half a year felt like one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. The palace staff moved quietly through the halls, sensing the weight of the moment even without knowing the specifics. Mrs. Patterson, their longtime housekeeper, had noticed the tension in William's shoulders when she brought his morning tea. She had worked for the royal family long enough to recognize the signs of difficult news. Outside, Catherine's voice called out to the children as they chased butterflies near the rose garden. Her laughter was music to William's ears, making the thought of leaving even more unbearable. He knew she would be strong, as she always was, but he also knew that beneath her composed exterior, she would be struggling with fears and worries that she would never voice aloud. The afternoon light began to fade as William finally made his decision. He would tell Catherine tonight after the children were asleep. They would need time to process this together, to figure out how to explain it to George and Charlotte, and most importantly, to hold each other through the difficult emotions that were sure to come. As he prepared to leave his study, William picked up the framed photograph on his desk. It showed Catherine and the children from their last family vacation in Scotland. They were all smiling, windblown and happy, completely unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. William touched the glass gently, promising himself that he would carry this image with him through every difficult day of his deployment. The weight of duty had always been heavy on William's shoulders, but tonight it felt almost crushing. He was not just a husband and father saying goodbye to his family. He was a future king, a military officer, and a man trying to balance all the different parts of his identity. The tearful goodbye that awaited them would test every ounce of strength they both possessed. The grandfather clock in the drawing room chimed 11 times as Catherine tucked Charlotte into her princess-themed bed. The little girl's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she fought to stay awake just a bit longer. William stood in the doorway, memorizing every detail of this peaceful moment, knowing it would be months before he would see it again. After the children were finally asleep, Catherine found William sitting on the edge of their bed, still holding the deployment letter. She had sensed something was wrong all day. The way he had been extra attentive during dinner, the lingering hugs he gave the children, and the distant look in his eyes had all been warning signs that something significant was happening. Catherine sat beside him without saying a word, her hand finding his. They had been together long enough that words weren't always necessary. She could read the tension in his posture, the way his jaw was set, and the careful way he was breathing. Whatever news he had to share, she knew it would change their lives in some fundamental way. When William finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The words came slowly, each one feeling like a small betrayal of the peaceful life they had built together. 6 months in the South Atlantic, classified mission. Departure in 3 days. As he explained the details he was allowed to share, Catherine felt her world shifting beneath her feet. But Catherine had learned long ago how to be strong when everything inside her wanted to fall apart. Growing up as a commoner who would one day become queen had taught her to hide her true feelings behind a composed mask. She listened without interrupting, asking practical questions about timing and communication, while her heart quietly broke into pieces. The hardest part wasn't the separation itself, but the uncertainty that came with military deployment. Catherine had read enough news reports to know that peacekeeping missions could become dangerous without warning. The Falkland Islands might seem peaceful now, but the political situation in the region was always fragile. Every day William was gone would be a day of quiet worry and careful hope. They talked through the night about how to tell the children, how to manage their royal duties while William was away, and how to maintain some sense of normalcy in their household. Catherine would need to attend events alone, represent the family at important functions, and somehow explain to George and Charlotte why Daddy's work was taking him so far away for so long. As dawn approached, they found themselves curled together on the window seat in their bedroom, watching the sun rise over London. Catherine had always loved this time of day, when the city was quiet and belonged just to them. Now she wondered how many more sunrises they would share before William had to leave. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as William began making arrangements for his deployment. Phone calls with his private secretary, meetings with security officials, and briefings about the mission filled his schedule. Catherine threw herself into planning how to manage their family life during his absence, but every practical decision felt like another small goodbye. George noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Children, Catherine knew, were much more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. He began asking direct questions about why Mommy and Daddy seemed sad, and why there were so many serious phone calls happening. Charlotte, following her brother's lead, became clingy and insisted on staying close to William whenever he was home. The couple decided to tell the children together after lunch on William's second-to-last day at home. They sat in the family room with George on William's lap, and Charlotte snuggled against Catherine's side. The conversation was one of the hardest either parent had ever had. They tried to explain military duty in terms that young children could understand, emphasizing that Daddy was going to help keep people safe, just like a superhero in their favorite stories. George, wise beyond his 8 years, asked if Daddy might get hurt. The question hung in the air like a challenge, demanding honesty in a situation where the truth was too complex and frightening for a child to fully grasp. William chose his words carefully, explaining that he would be very careful and that many other brave people would be working together to keep everyone safe. Charlotte, not fully understanding the implications but sensing the gravity of the moment, began to cry. Her tears triggered something in Catherine that she had been holding back since William first shared the news. For the first time since learning about the deployment, Catherine allowed herself to show her true emotions, holding her daughter close while her own tears fell freely. That evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine and William began the process of their own private goodbye. They knew that the public farewell at the airfield would be formal and watched by cameras from around the world. This was their time to be vulnerable, to express their fears and their love without the weight of royal protocol. The final morning arrived with unseasonable rain, as if the weather itself understood the sadness of the day. Catherine woke before dawn, having barely slept, and found William already awake beside her. They lay in silence for a while, listening to the rain against the windows and holding on to these last precious moments of ordinary married life. Breakfast was a quiet affair. George picked at his cereal while Charlotte insisted on sitting on William's lap, somehow sensing that this morning was different from all the others. The palace staff moved around them with careful efficiency, packing William's bags and making final preparations for his departure. Every mundane detail felt significant now that it was happening for the last time in months. Catherine had chosen her outfit carefully for the public farewell. A navy blue coat that William had once said he loved, paired with a hat that would partially shield her face from the cameras. She knew that every expression, every gesture would be scrutinized by the media and the public. The private Catherine, the one who was terrified of losing her husband, would have to be hidden beneath the composed exterior of the Duchess of Cambridge. The children had been prepared for what would happen at the airfield. They would say goodbye to Daddy in front of many people. There would be cameras, and they needed to be brave. George, understanding his role as the older sibling, promised to take care of Mommy and Charlotte while Daddy was away. His serious 8-year-old face nearly broke Catherine's heart with its determination to be grown up. The drive to the airfield was tense despite their efforts to keep conversation light. William pointed out landmarks to the children, trying to create normal memories on this most abnormal of days. Catherine held his hand tightly, her fingers intertwined with his as if she could somehow anchor him to her through sheer force of will. When they arrived at the base, the reality of the situation hit with full force. The aircraft that would take William away sat waiting on the tarmac, massive and imposing against the gray sky. Military personnel moved with practiced efficiency, but Catherine could see the respectful distance they maintained, understanding that this family needed space for their goodbye. The official ceremony was brief but emotionally charged. William's commanding officer spoke about duty and service, while Catherine stood with the children, her hand protectively on Charlotte's shoulder and her other arm around George. She could feel the weight of the cameras recording every moment, knowing that this scene would be broadcast around the world within hours. But it was the private moments between the official formalities that truly mattered. When William knelt down to hug George, whispering something in his son's ear that made the boy nod solemnly. When he scooped Charlotte up for one last spinning hug, her delighted giggle cutting through the somber atmosphere like sunshine through clouds. And then it was Catherine's turn. Everything they had said to each other over the past 3 days, all the promises and fears and expressions of love, seemed inadequate in the face of this final moment. William took her hands in his, looking into her eyes with an intensity that shut out everything else around them. The embrace that followed was witnessed by millions, but it belonged entirely to them. Catherine felt William's arms tighten around her as if he was trying to memorize the feeling of holding her. She buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent and trying to commit every detail to memory. The wool of his uniform, the warmth of his skin, the way his hand curved protectively around the back of her head. When they finally separated, both had tears streaming down their faces. Catherine's carefully applied makeup was ruined, her composed royal mask completely gone. This was simply a wife saying goodbye to her husband, and the raw emotion of that truth resonated with everyone watching. William wiped her tears with his thumb, a gesture so tender and intimate that it seemed to stop time itself. The final call came too soon. William had to board the aircraft, and their goodbye had to end. He kissed Catherine one last time, soft and lingering before turning to hug the children once more. George stood very straight, trying to be brave, while Charlotte clung to her father's neck as if she could prevent him from leaving through pure determination. As William walked toward the plane, he turned back 3 times. Each look was a small goodbye in itself, a desperate attempt to hold on to the sight of his family for as long as possible. Catherine stood with the children, Charlotte now in her arms and George pressed against her side, all 3 of them waving until William disappeared into the aircraft. The engines roared to life, drowning out any possibility of final words. Catherine felt Charlotte's small hand touch her cheek, the little girl's innocent attempt to comfort her mother. George reached up and took Catherine's free hand, squeezing it with surprising strength for someone so young. As the plane taxied down the runway, Catherine thought about all the military wives who had stood in similar places, watching their husbands disappear into uncertain horizons. She was not alone in this experience, but that knowledge did little to ease the ache in her chest as William's plane lifted off into the cloudy sky. The weeks following William's departure settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and completely foreign. Catherine threw herself into her royal duties with renewed focus, as if staying busy could somehow make the time pass more quickly. But every morning brought the same moment of disorientation when she reached across the bed to find William's side cold and empty. The children adapted in the way that children do, with remarkable resilience mixed with moments of deep sadness. George began asking more questions about geography, wanting to understand exactly where his father was and how far away that meant he would be. Charlotte developed a habit of setting a place for Daddy at dinner every night, insisting that he might come home unexpectedly and would need somewhere to sit. Communication with William came in carefully scheduled phone calls and video chats, each one a precious lifeline across the thousands of miles that separated them. The time difference meant that Catherine often found herself awake at strange hours, clutching her phone and waiting for his call. When his voice finally came through, scratchy from the satellite connection, she would close her eyes and pretend he was just in the next room. The hardest moments came at unexpected times, when George scored his first goal in a school football match and looked to the sidelines for his father's proud smile. When Charlotte had a nightmare and called for Daddy to check under her bed for monsters. When Catherine attended a charity gala alone and caught herself turning to share a whispered comment with William, only to remember that his seat beside her was empty. The media coverage of William's deployment was intense but respectful. Photos of Catherine at various events always seemed to focus on her left hand, looking for signs that she was struggling without her wedding ring partner beside her. Royal correspondents speculated about how the separation was affecting the family, but most seemed to understand that this was a genuine sacrifice for duty rather than a publicity stunt. Catherine's mother, Carol, became a constant presence during those first few weeks. She would arrive at Kensington Palace early in the morning to help with the children's breakfast routine, staying late into the evening to provide adult conversation when the royal duties of the day were finally complete. Her practical support was invaluable, but even more important was having someone who understood that behind the Duchess was simply a daughter, missing her husband. The royal household staff, who had served the family for years, developed an unspoken understanding about Catherine's needs during this time. Mrs. Patterson would ensure that William's favorite tea was still served at breakfast, a small comfort that helped maintain the illusion that he might walk through the door at any moment. The security team adjusted their routines to give Catherine and the children more privacy during their most vulnerable moments. Sleep became elusive for Catherine. She would lie awake at night, listening to sounds from the London streets below and wondering what William was doing at that exact moment. The 8-hour time difference meant that when she was going to bed, he was likely just starting his day. She began writing him letters by hand, old-fashioned correspondence that felt more personal than emails or text messages. George began showing signs of taking his role as the man of the house very seriously. He would check the locks on doors before bedtime, something he had never done before. He started asking Catherine if she needed help with tasks that William would normally handle. His sweet attempts at being protective broke Catherine's heart while simultaneously filling her with pride at his growing maturity. Charlotte's way of coping was different but equally touching. She began carrying around a small photo of William in her school bag, showing it to her teacher and classmates when she missed him particularly badly. She would talk to the picture at bedtime, telling Daddy about her day as if he could hear her through the photograph. The first-month milestone brought a mix of accomplishment and despair. Catherine realized she had survived 4 weeks without William, proof that she was stronger than she had thought. But the same calculation also meant that they were only 1/6 of the way through the separation, a mathematical reality that felt overwhelming when she thought about it too directly. Public appearances became both easier and harder as time went on. Catherine developed a professional composure that could carry her through even the most emotionally challenging events. But the cost of maintaining that facade was exhaustion that went bone deep. She would return to Kensington Palace after a day of smiling and speaking engagements, collapsing into bed fully clothed and too tired to even remove her makeup. The letters from William became treasured possessions. He wrote about the landscape of the Falkland Islands, the other military personnel he was serving with, and the small details of daily life that helped Catherine picture his world. But between the lines she could read his own loneliness and longing. His descriptions of South Atlantic sunsets always ended with wishes that she could see them with him. One particularly difficult evening, after Charlotte had cried herself to sleep asking when Daddy was coming home, Catherine found herself standing in William's study, surrounded by his books and photographs. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, and for a moment she allowed herself to break down completely. The weight of single parenthood, public scrutiny, and her own grief finally overwhelmed the careful composure she had maintained for weeks. It was in that moment of vulnerability that Catherine understood something important about military families around the world. This experience of separation and uncertainty was shared by thousands of other wives and husbands, parents and children. Her royal status made her separation more visible, but it didn't make her pain any more or less significant than that of any other military family facing the same challenges. The halfway point of William's deployment arrived with an unexpected phone call that changed everything. Catherine was reading bedtime stories to Charlotte when her private secretary knocked urgently on the bedroom door. There had been an incident in the South Atlantic, and while William was safe, his mission had been extended indefinitely due to escalating tensions in the region. The news hit Catherine like a physical blow. 6 months had already felt like an eternity, and now they were being asked to endure an unknown amount of additional time apart. She managed to finish Charlotte's story with a steady voice, but once her daughter was asleep, Catherine locked herself in the bathroom and sobbed until she had no tears left. The extended deployment meant recalibrating everything they had planned. School events that William had hoped to attend via video call from his return location would now be missed entirely. Charlotte's upcoming birthday party would definitely happen without Daddy present. George's first rugby match of the season would have an empty space where his father should have been cheering from the sidelines. Catherine made the decision not to tell the children about the extension immediately. She needed time to process the news herself and figure out how to present it in a way that wouldn't devastate them. Instead, she threw herself into planning special activities that might help compensate for their father's continued absence. The royal family rallied around Catherine and the children during this particularly difficult time. Prince Charles began making more frequent visits to Kensington Palace, often arriving with small gifts for George and Charlotte, or simply spending an afternoon playing games with them. His presence provided a steady male influence that helped fill some of the void left by William's absence. Princess Anne, known for her practical approach to challenges, became an unexpected source of support for Catherine. Having been a single mother herself during her divorce, Anne understood the complexity of managing children's emotions while dealing with personal grief. Her no-nonsense advice helped Catherine develop coping strategies that went beyond simply enduring each day. The Queen, now in her 90s but still sharp as ever, invited Catherine for private tea sessions where they could speak openly about the challenges of royal duty versus family needs. These conversations helped Catherine understand that the struggle between personal desires and public obligations was something every royal had faced throughout history. William's letters from this period reflected his own struggle with the news of the extension. His handwriting became more urgent, filled with apologies for circumstances beyond his control and promises to make everything up to them when he finally returned. He began including small sketches in his letters, drawings of the local wildlife and landscapes that he hoped would help the children feel connected to his daily experience. The media response to news of the extended deployment was mixed. Some outlets praised William's dedication to duty, while others questioned whether a future king should be putting himself in potentially dangerous situations for extended periods. Catherine found herself defending her husband's choices in a rare televised interview, speaking passionately about the importance of service and sacrifice. George's reaction to finally learning about the extension surprised everyone. Rather than the tears Catherine had expected, he became very quiet and thoughtful. Later that evening, she found him in his room writing a letter to his father. When she asked what he was writing about, George explained that he wanted Daddy to know that he was proud of him for helping keep people safe, even if it meant being away longer. Charlotte's response was more dramatic but equally touching. She announced that she was going to make Daddy a special present that would take a very long time to finish, so it would be ready whenever he came home. She began working on an elaborate drawing that depicted their entire family together, adding new details every day as her artistic skills improved. The routine of life continued, but everything felt more fragile now that they knew the end date was uncertain. Catherine began to understand why military families talked about taking things one day at a time. Planning too far into the future felt dangerous when so much was beyond their control. Video calls with William became more precious and more painful simultaneously. The technology that allowed them to see each other across the ocean also highlighted everything they were missing. Catherine could see the exhaustion in William's eyes, the way his face had become leaner and more weathered. William could see the burden Catherine was carrying in her posture and the shadows under her eyes. One evening, during a particularly difficult video call where Charlotte had been crying and asking when Daddy was coming home, the connection suddenly cut out. Technical difficulties meant they couldn't reconnect for 3 days, leaving both sides of the family wondering if the other was okay. Those 3 days of silence taught Catherine that uncertainty was often worse than bad news. When the connection was finally restored, the relief in both William's and Catherine's voices was audible, even through the poor audio quality. They spent the entire call just looking at each other, afraid to waste time on trivial conversation when every moment felt so precious. The extended separation began to change the family dynamic in subtle but significant ways. George started making more independent decisions, consulting with Catherine rather than asking permission. Charlotte became more articulate about her emotions, developing a vocabulary for loneliness and missing someone that most children her age wouldn't need. Catherine herself began to discover strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Managing royal duties while single parenting was teaching her that she was more resilient than she had ever imagined. But strength, she learned, didn't mean not missing William any less. If anything, proving she could handle everything alone only made her more aware of how much better everything was when they faced challenges together. As autumn approached with no clear end to the deployment in sight, Catherine began to prepare herself mentally for the possibility that William might not be home for Christmas. The thought was almost unbearable, but she knew that hope without preparation would be unfair to the children if disappointment came. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. Catherine had been deep asleep when her secure phone rang, and the unfamiliar number made her heart race with fear. Military calls at odd hours rarely brought good news, but the voice on the other end was William's commanding officer with the words she had been praying to hear for months. William would be coming home. The political situation that had extended his deployment had finally been resolved through diplomatic channels. William's unit would be returning to England within the week, just in time for Charlotte's birthday and well ahead of Christmas. Catherine sat in her dark bedroom, clutching the phone and trying to process the reality that their long nightmare was finally ending. Her first instinct was to wake the children immediately and share the wonderful news, but maternal wisdom held her back. George and Charlotte had already been disappointed by false hopes and delayed returns. She would wait until she had more concrete details about timing before getting their hopes up. Instead, she lay awake for the rest of the night, planning and replaying the conversation, hardly daring to believe it was real. The next few days passed in a blur of careful preparations. Catherine coordinated with William's security team to plan his return in a way that would give the family maximum privacy for their reunion. The media would want to cover his homecoming, but she was determined that their first moments together would belong to them alone. She finally told the children on Thursday evening, choosing the moment carefully after a particularly good day when both were in happy moods. The reaction was everything she had hoped for and more. George whooped with joy and immediately began planning all the things he wanted to show his father. Charlotte burst into tears of happiness and insisted on calling her grandfather to share the news. The palace staff began subtle preparations for William's return. His favorite foods were ordered, his study was cleaned and reorganized, and fresh flowers were placed throughout their private apartments. Everyone who worked for the family seemed to understand that this homecoming needed to be perfect in every small detail. Catherine found herself obsessing over her appearance in a way she hadn't since their early dating days. She wanted to look perfect for William's return, but she also wanted him to see how she had grown and changed during their separation. The confident, capable woman who had managed everything in his absence was different from the uncertain wife who had said goodbye at the airfield months earlier. The final video call before his departure from the Falklands was emotional for entirely different reasons than all the previous ones. Instead of sadness and longing, the connection was filled with excitement and anticipation. William looked different too, more weathered by his experience, but somehow more himself than he had been in months. Charlotte had finished her special drawing for Daddy and proudly held it up to the camera. The artwork had evolved over the months into an elaborate family portrait with incredibly detailed figures and a rainbow that took up half the page. William's reaction to seeing it made Catherine cry happy tears for the first time in months. George had grown noticeably during the deployment, and William marveled at how mature his son had become. The 8-year-old's sense of responsibility and protectiveness toward his mother had developed in ways that were both admirable and heartbreaking. William could see in George's eyes that the little boy understood things about sacrifice and duty, that most children his age never had to learn. The night before William's return, Catherine barely slept again, but this time it was excitement rather than worry that kept her awake. She found herself walking through their home in the early morning hours, seeing everything with fresh eyes. Soon these rooms would feel complete again, filled with William's presence and the easy family dynamics they had all missed so desperately. The children were too excited to eat breakfast properly, picking at their food and constantly asking what time Daddy's plane would land. Catherine had arranged for them to go to the airfield again, this time for a much happier reason. The contrast with that terrible morning months earlier would be stark and healing for all of them. As they prepared to leave for the airfield, Catherine looked at herself in the mirror one last time. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had said goodbye to William all those months ago. She had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known existed, had managed challenges she had never faced before, and had kept their family functioning during the hardest period of their marriage. The drive to the airfield felt completely different from the sad journey they had made months earlier. The children chattered excitedly about all the things they wanted to tell Daddy, while Catherine found herself nervous in a way that reminded her of their first date. Would William still find her attractive? Would they still fit together the way they always had? Would the experience of separation have changed them too much? When they arrived at the base, the same aircraft hangar looked transformed by the context of reunion rather than separation. Military personnel moved with the same efficiency, but now they were preparing for arrival rather than departure. The energy was celebratory rather than solemn, and even the weather seemed to cooperate with bright sunshine breaking through the November clouds. Catherine could see William's plane in the distance, growing larger as it approached the runway. Her heart began beating so fast she thought it might burst. After months of video calls and letters, photographs and dreams, she was about to hold her husband again. The children pressed against the window, waving at a plane that was still too far away to see them, but their excitement was infectious and pure. When the aircraft finally landed and taxied toward them, Catherine felt the same mix of emotions she had experienced on their wedding day. Joy, relief, anticipation, and a love so strong it felt like it might overwhelm her completely. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, dreaming about, and desperately needing. Their family was about to be complete again. The aircraft door opened, and William appeared at the top of the stairs. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that he was searching the small crowd for their faces. When his eyes found hers, the smile that spread across his features was so bright it seemed to light up the entire airfield. The months of separation, the uncertainty, the sleepless nights, and the constant worry all dissolved in that single moment of connection. Charlotte broke free from Catherine's hand and ran toward the plane before anyone could stop her. Her little legs carried her across the tarmac with determination that surprised everyone, including the security team. William saw her coming and abandoned all protocol, jogging down the stairs to meet his daughter halfway. When he scooped her up and spun her around, her delighted laughter echoed across the airfield. George followed more carefully but with equal enthusiasm. At 8 years old, he was trying to maintain some dignity while still showing his excitement. When William knelt down to hug him, George whispered something in his father's ear that made William's eyes well up with tears. Later, Catherine would learn that George had said, "I took good care of Mummy just like you asked me to." And then it was Catherine's turn. As she walked toward William, time seemed to slow down. She noticed everything about him in vivid detail, how his uniform hung on his frame, which had become leaner during the deployment. The new lines around his eyes that spoke of months of stress and responsibility, the way his hair was slightly longer than she remembered, the familiar way he stood, weight shifted to one foot that she had missed so desperately. When they finally reached each other, they stood for a moment, just looking. All the words they had planned to say, all the emotions they had saved up for this moment seemed inadequate in the face of simply being together again. William reached out and touched Catherine's face gently, as if reassuring himself that she was real and not another dream. The embrace that followed was different from their goodbye hug months earlier. Where that had been desperate and clinging, this was profound and healing. Catherine felt William's arms around her and knew that she was finally home, even though they were standing on a windswept airfield. The relief of having him back was so overwhelming that she couldn't stop the tears that came, but these were tears of pure joy. William buried his face in Catherine's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and perfume. "I'm home," he whispered against her ear, and those simple words contained everything he had wanted to say during months of separation. Catherine nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak past the emotion that was choking her throat. The children pressed close, creating a family huddle that shut out the rest of the world. Charlotte chattered excitedly about everything William had missed, while George maintained his protective stance next to his mother. For several minutes they stood together in their own bubble of happiness while the November wind swirled around them. The formal welcome ceremony that followed was brief but meaningful. William's commanding officer spoke about duty fulfilled and service honored, while photographers captured images that would be published around the world. But Catherine barely heard the words. She was too busy watching William's face as he looked at their children, seeing the wonder in his eyes as he noticed how much they had grown and changed. The drive home to Kensington Palace was filled with overlapping conversations as everyone tried to share months of experiences at once. Charlotte showed William her special drawing, unfolding it carefully from her school bag. George explained his improved football skills and promised to show Daddy his new moves as soon as they got home. Catherine simply held William's hand and listened to the sound of his voice. Filling their car again, walking through the doors of their home together felt surreal, after so many months of Catherine entering alone. William stopped in the entryway and looked around as if seeing everything for the first time. The children pulled him from room to room, showing him things that had changed and things that had stayed exactly the same. Everything felt familiar yet somehow new, transformed by the experience of separation and reunion. That evening, after the children were finally asleep and the excitement of the day had settled into quiet contentment, William and Catherine sat together in their bedroom. They talked through the night, sharing experiences that couldn't be conveyed in letters or video calls. William spoke about the isolation and responsibility he had felt so far from home. Catherine described the challenges of single parenting and public life without her partner. But mostly they simply held each other, relearning the comfortable rhythms of being together. The way Catherine's head fit perfectly on William's shoulder. The way his hand automatically found hers even when he was half asleep. The ordinary miracles of shared space and synchronized breathing that they had taken for granted before the deployment. In the days that followed, the family slowly readjusted to being together again. There were small awkwardnesses as they navigated routines that had changed during William's absence. Charlotte was more clingy than before, afraid to let Daddy out of her sight. George sometimes forgot that he no longer needed to be the man of the house, occasionally trying to take charge in situations where William was present. But there were also beautiful discoveries. William and Catherine found that their relationship had been strengthened rather than damaged by the test of separation. They had both grown during their time apart, becoming more independent while also appreciating their partnership more deeply. The love that had sustained them through months of separation had emerged even stronger and more resilient. The photo that appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world showed the moment of their reunion embrace. Catherine's tears were visible, her carefully applied makeup ruined by emotion. William's face was buried against her shoulder, his relief and joy evident even though his expression was hidden. The image captured something universal about love, separation, and reunion that resonated with people far beyond the royal family. Years later, when George and Charlotte were older and able to understand the full significance of that deployment, they would ask their parents about that time. Catherine and William would tell them that it was one of the hardest periods of their marriage, but also one of the most important. It had taught them that their love could survive anything, that duty and family could coexist even when they seemed to conflict, and that coming home was always sweeter after being away. The tearful hug that had touched every heart became a symbol of enduring love in the face of sacrifice. It reminded the world that behind the titles and the protocol, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were simply a husband and wife who had missed each other desperately and found their way back together again.